Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's a huge pleasure to be here, and my heartfelt thanks to Kate and to the State of Design Festival for inviting me out here, and of course to wonderful Grimshaw and the British Council as well. I'm going to crack on with the matter in hand, however, and talk to you about your home city, Melbourne, which as an architect I would have probably talked about for at least, well, the hour that I have, in terms that architects are used to talk about cities, in other words, about the buildings and the form and the public spaces and all those exciting things that we architects like to talk about. And certainly 20 years ago, in any case, I would never once have mentioned this landscape in that conversation. This now seems to me to be a gross oversight on my behalf, and I have to say the epiphany that occurred to me roughly 10 years ago, actually, which was that if you're going to talk about cities, you have to talk about the productive hinterland, without which they couldn't exist. And as the world urbanizes, and I'm sure you're all aware that there is a very, very steep graph that predicts that by 2050 there's going to be double the number of people living in cities globally than there is now, we simply have to confront the flip side of the city that's increasingly invisible to us. And in fact, it sort of creates what I call the urban paradox, because we have powerful needs as humans. We like to be with one another. It's very nice to see so many of you here tonight. This kind of gathering, of course, is only possible because we have cities. We can't share ideas like this if we're all living off in the jungle on our own. So sociability is extremely important to us. It really defines what civilization is. On the other hand, we're animals and we have to eat. And the bigger the lumps of humanity that we choose to live in, the further away we get from the sources of our sustenance. And it creates what I've come to call the urban paradox. And it really is a paradox because there's no ideal solution to it. But I don't think that should stop us from confronting it. In fact, I think it's very urgent and important that we do. So in the next 57 and a half minutes, I hope I'm going to give you some tools with which to do that. Now, it's quite interesting that I like to think of myself as someone that thinks a lot. In fact, somebody described me like that the other day, which I was very pleased by. But, I do tend to worry about things. So it strikes me as really odd that I was capable of studying architecture in cities for, call it 20 years, without the food thing, as it were, ever really coming across my radar. And I've since puzzled about how it was possible. And I've decided that it's because we have an urban-centric view of the world, which is beautifully encapsulated by this 1410 image of Rome, of obviously a very, very important city, certainly at that time, the centre of the Christian Empire, full of very, very important monuments and public spaces and all those things that, as I say, as an architect, I like to think about. And this kind of weird sort of smear of green stuff around the outside that really doesn't look important or interesting at all. And I think it beautifully sums up the way we tend to see the relationship between the city and its productive hinterland, is kind of from the city looking out, making the sort of the other half of urbanity, as it were, invisible. And it's actually even more interesting than that, because if you look at the history of the way urbanites or city dwellers have talked about farming and the production of food, it's kind of got an element of fantasy about it, actually. And this is beautifully encapsulated by this image, the view of London from Highgate. I mean, of course, the view of London from Highgate now is London, if you see what I mean. But in those days, of course, London was still a kind of dense blob of urbanity. You can see the smoke rising in the distance on that picture. And essentially, this image comes from the end of the English agricultural revolution, basically 250 years or so of tearing up kind of what was there before, i.e. forest, and planting productive fields, clearing peasants off their sort of strips of land in order to enclose land and surround little sort of patches of land with hedges, as you can see on the left of the image, to make the land more productive, and so on. It was actually a very brutal nationwide social upheaval that caused incredible hardship. But the view of it, and the urban view that you're looking at here, is kind of the pastoral idyll that was being created by all of these interventions. And in fact, you can see people, picnicking in the shrubbery on the sort of bottom right, and beautifully dressed peasants with, velvet hats on, kind of bringing in the harvest and so on. It's a complete fantasy. And in fact, at this time, it was very popular to mount plays, in noble houses and so on, with, real shepherds with real sheep kind of coming onto the stage and so on. And people kind of had this incredible fantasy idea of what the productive hinterland was all about. And interestingly, as cities industrialized and got bigger, the fantasy grew. So we've just been looking at the urban fantasy about farming and the productive hinterland, but as cities got bigger and farming got further and further away from the sight and mind, people began to idolize a different kind of nature, and this is the first time this has happened. People began to romanticize unproductive nature, i.e. places like Yosemite National Park in America, which was the second national park to be created in the world, which was described by John Muir, who managed to persuade Teddy Roosevelt to start enclosing areas of land and worshipping them from outside, as it were, that, this kind of nature was to be revered and not to be used. This, of course, involved removing the native Almanichi Indians to, they do call themselves Indians, by the way, to a reserve in order to preserve the landscape that actually, as it turns out, they'd been very instrumental in creating. And there's a very interesting history that I unfortunately don't have time to go into in great detail about the ownership of land, as seen by people like John Locke in Britain, in the UK, as being to do with having, put work into it. In other words, it was the farming view of the right to own land, was that you'd sort of tilled it and ploughed it and stuck seeds in it, i.e. the farming view. And of course, that was not what the Native Americans did at all. So the European settlers had no idea that they actually had any kind of sense of ownership of the land. And of course, this is a subject that, you'll be very familiar with in a similar situation in Australia. Now, it's not surprising that city dwellers had kind of stopped writing poetry about farming at that point and had turned instead to the wilderness and started to revere that instead, because this is what was happening to farming around the same time. It was industrializing, it was going indoors, it was becoming highly mechanized. This is an image from Cincinnati, which was the first major meatpacking center in the world, colloquially known as Porkopolis because of the number of pigs it processed every year. And in fact, there's a whole series of details I immediately want to tell you about that I don't have time for, but just one. Basically, pigs had freedom of the city and were allowed to wander around at will. And actually, there was a law that you had to put your food waste in the middle of the road, so it was easier for the pigs to come and eat it before they got trotted off to the abattoir. So it just goes to show, what happens when sort of, the production of food gets sort of truly, efficient in industrial terms. Now, of course, as we all know, but many of us probably have never witnessed, Porkopolis still exists. This business of eating a huge amount of meat and getting more and more, quote-unquote, efficient about how we produce it is something that's never stopped since those days 150 years ago. And in fact, this is a modern meat packing plant. Of course, very few of us will have ever seen spaces like this because they're run a bit like military installations. It's extremely difficult to get into them. The food industry these days is extremely sensitive about who does or doesn't see what they're up to. And of course, the fact that I'm talking a lot about meat at the start of this talk is not accidental either, because there's a direct correlation between the number of people living in cities and the amount of meat consumed globally. And in fact, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has said that the world is in the grip of a livestock revolution, and is also predicting that the number of people living in cities not only is going to double by 2050, but the amount of meat and dairy we consume globally is also going to double. Now, this is interesting and ironic, because if you leap back 10,000 years and look at the true origins of cities, you'll find that it's actually bound up not with meat at all, but with grain, an entirely different food source. And in fact, it was the first time that people had experimented with eating anything other than meat, which is basically what they subsisted on before, meat and berries, obviously, i.e. hunter-gatherers. And it happened at the end of the last ice age when the ice receded north. And essentially, there were food shortages, and people began to experiment with this radical new form of food, i.e. grain. The Fertile Crescent is an area of the ancient Near East that was both fertile and crescent-shaped, hence the name. You can see in the dotted lines that was where the ancient antecedents of modern wheat and barley existed, and people began to say, hey, you know, animals eat this stuff, maybe we could too, and essentially camp next door to fields of natural wheat and barley and wait for it to kind of become ripe and then try to do something with it. Actually, they made a kind of hideous-sounding porridge with it to start off with for a few thousand years. Doesn't sound too appealing. A bit like the breakfast I had on the plane coming over here, actually. But anyway, we won't go into that. If you look at the sort of bottom, I can't point at the screen, by the way, because it's digitized, so it's like the digital age kind of going into a negative feedback loop. I can't actually use a laser pointer for once. But anyway, the bottom right of the Fertile Crescent, you'll see a little group of settlements there that are actually the first farming settlements, effectively, that archaeologists agree deserve to be called cities, because they've got zoning, interestingly. That's what archaeologists require a farming settlement to have before they think it deserves to be called urban. The zoning, interestingly, is all about food production, in fact, farming. And if you look at the map of one of those early cities, the city of from 2000 BC, you see what they're talking about. Essentially, you've got a very dense, small city. If you look at that sort of black blob of stuff where it says residential area, you just have to imagine the whole city filled with that. Basically, they hadn't done the excavations by then, so most of it looks white, but actually it would be black-eyed. There was absolutely no open space at all. Apart from that large compound, the temple compound that you can see sort of, basically dominating the city. And interestingly, the temple was not only the spiritual heart of the city, but it was also where the farming accounts were done. In fact, a lot of people have argued that it was the need to keep accounts of the harvest that led the ancient Sumerians to invent writing, because they had to sort of write down who was producing what and who deserved to get what and so on. Actually, who got what was the gods. That's what the temple did. It organised the annual harvest, gathered it in, offered it to the gods, who ate what they wanted, and then the food was taken out again, stored in municipal granaries, which you can also see in that temple complex if you've got extraordinarily bionic eyesight, and was then fed back to the people during the course of the year. So, I mean, you could say, in a sense, that the temple was really a sort of large, spiritualized food distribution hub. And that is really how early cities solved the problem of feeding themselves. I mean, they evolved in order to exploit grain, and then they sort of divided up labour in order to organise the annual agrarian ritual of the harvest, which was seen as a spiritual ritual, and then they sort of, as it were, controlled the land immediately around them and shaped it to their own ends. So effectively, we're looking at a sort of semi-independent trading city-state, and that is the early model of the city. Now, clearly, if you're basically a kind of large, zoned, spiritualized farming community with writing, your perception of your life as being dependent on the ground and on the increased fertility every springtime is uppermost. And in fact, if you look at any ancient city, there's a very profound linking of the idea of a city to the ground and to the soil and to the fertility of the soil. And this is very, very prevalent in Roman city founding rituals, of which this, actually, I have to admit, Etruscan little model, but actually the Romans really were Etruscans, or if they weren't, they were so darn near Etruscans and they nicked all their ideas anyway, they may as well have been. So anyway, but Roman city founding rituals are identical to Etruscan ones, put it that way. Sorry, I digress. In any case, I just don't want someone in the back saying, that's not Roman, that's Etruscan, you know, the kind of thing, and then writing letters later. Or you don't do letters anymore, do you? Do emails? Anyway, essentially, there's some very, very interesting things about this little votive object. One of which is that before founding a city, what happened in Etruria and in Rome is that the landscape was interrogated, essentially to see whether it was going to be capable of supporting an urban population. And then a sacred furrow was dug, which is indicated by the round bit at the outside, which the city walls were going to follow. And where there was going to be a gate, the plough was lifted up and then put down again, because it was otherwise basically a sin punishable by death to jump across this sacred furrow. which in fact, if any of you remember the myth about Romulus and Remus founding Rome, and this weird bit where Remus has a leap of joy and Romulus just bops him on the head and says, sorry mate, you shouldn't have done that, and kills his brother, which never made any sense to me at all. Do you know this myth? Is this sort of, yeah. Anyway, that's what they were doing. They were actually ploughing this furrow, and Remus jumped over it, which he wasn't allowed to do. Romulus killed him. Remus sort of dies on the ground, and the sacrifice of Remus is mythically what made the soil fertile, because of course sacrifices to the gods of the underworld were fundamental to this ritual as well. In fact, a hole was dug in the soil at the centre of a Roman city, and sacrifices made to the gods of the underworld in order for the soil to be made fertile. I'm getting into terrifying amounts of detail. This is really disastrous anyway. So what you have at the centre of every Roman city, and it's true of Rome as well as anywhere else, is a thing called a mundus, which is this hole, the sacrificial hole that ties the city, understood to be literally marrying the city to the soil, as the centre, the spiritual centre of the city, usually in the forum somewhere around. In fact, you can see one round building called the Aedes Vestae, again with those of you with bionic eyesight, kind of, about a fifth in on the left. The Vestal Virgins, if you've ever heard of them, that was their job. It was to look after Rome's mundus, the sacred hole that sort of, as it were, tied it to the earth. So Rome understood the importance of fertile soil, and no surprise, because unlike those early cities, it grew to an absolutely enormous size. It had 1 million citizens, roughly, by the 1st century AD. That's what it looked like, this fabulous model from 300 AD that's in Ayer, which I'd recommend any of you about to go to Rome to go and have a look at. I don't know why I said that, but anyway, it's a fabulous model, and I love it. But nevertheless, a city this big, I mean, the problem of feeding it was absolutely huge. And if you think about what I've been talking about so far, I've been talking about food production and the fact that grain is the only food we've ever discovered capable of feeding urban populations. But the other problem with feeding cities is how do you actually physically get the food in? Now, of course, if you've got 1 million citizens like Rome does, that was a major problem. And the way it solved it was by what I call Roman food miles. You might have heard of food miles, and obviously it's something we talk about a lot now in terms of industrial food systems, but it's not new. In fact, Rome had precisely that solution to its supply needs 2,000 years ago. As you can see from this map, it basically annexed the whole of the Mediterranean, quite a bit of the Black Sea, and the whole North Atlantic coast in order to feed itself. It had to get its food from the coast because actually the sea was the only way it could possibly transport the food long enough distances in a practical manner. And in fact, it was about 50 times cheaper to transport food overseas than overland in those days. And of course, grain being the really critical food, the one that emperors would literally lose their heads over if they failed to feed the people, because up to 1/3 of the Roman population were fed on a free state grain dole called the anana. Essentially, they waged war sequentially on Sicily and Sardinia, you can see close to Italy, then Carthage, and finally Egypt, where they exported 6,000 farmers plus suitable military backup in order to make sure that the food production happened and got into the city safely. Now, the first person to analyse this relationship, the critical relationship between cities and their productive hinterlands, was a German geographer and landowner called Johann von Thunen, who in 1826 wrote a book called The Isolated State. And the isolated state was a ubiquitous, featureless, fertile plain inhabited only by logical, profit-seeking farmers. So I usually say it's a bit like the Netherlands or somewhere like that. But anyway, and that's indicated by the sort of half a circle on the left. And what he said was, if a city represented by the pink blob in the middle basically started to evolve a rural hinterland, that it would obviously have a ring of market gardening right close to the city, because it's very difficult to transport fruit and vegetables. It makes sense to have them near the city. Also, fruit and veg growers can make use of night sol from the city, which is a polite word for human and animal manure, to fertilise their crops, and they can get very high profits from growing those crops and therefore afford the high rent. Then there's about a 20-mile band of grain production, because it's very difficult to get the grain in from any further away because there's because it's very heavy and bulky and difficult to transport. And that, of course, limits the size to which the city grows, because, once that band has been extended, that's really limiting how the city can feed itself. And then the outer band is livestock grazing, because, of course, animals can walk into the city and therefore be raised a lot further away. And indeed, it was the case that, even the animals that fed ancient Rome or pre-industrial London came from many hundreds of miles away. Now, Von Thunen was a German, so he doesn't seem to really sort of taken the whole business of sea into account, but his one concession to geography was the fact that if the city was on a navigable river, then obviously it could get its food in from a lot further away because it could sail it up the river. And, that's the last I'm going to sort of make you sit and look at diagrams, because it's far more interesting if you look at real cities, like my hometown London, for instance, which at this stage, because this is a map from 1801, is still a dense urban blob over on the left, on a navigable river, the Thames. And if you look at how the food was actually arriving in the city, it really follows everything I've been saying. In other words, grain was coming in by river, and therefore arriving at the two river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate, trying to make its way up into the main market, which was Cheapside, which ran through the middle of the city, and as it were, getting bought and sold on the way, which is why you start finding streets called things like Bread Street going up to it. Fish is obviously coming in by river as well. That's a no-brainer. Obviously, again, Friday Street is where you bought your fish on a Friday when the eating of meat was forbidden, as it was for many hundreds of years. And Billingsgate, I should point out, which was one of the main river ports, actually continued trading as a fish market until the mid-1980s, which is really quite incredible when you think about it, when the city was something like kind of 10 million strong. And this tells you something else very important about food, which is that once its journeys, the routes it travels down are established, they very, very rarely move. There's incredible inertia to food systems. And last but not least, of course, meat. Londoners have always liked their meat. That was walking in, so it wasn't coming in from the river. It was actually coming in from places like Scotland and Wales to the northwest. So most of London's meat came into the northwest of the city and traded in Newgate initially, and then ultimately Smithfield, where indeed meat is still traded today, which just is another example of the longevity of these foodways. And I just want to point out as well that, poultry, which is where the Bank of England now sits, was so named because the turkeys and geese for London were mainly bred in the northeast, in East Anglia, and so they waddled into town from that direction, and when they hit the east end of Cheapside, that's where they were bought and sold. And actually the street names of cities very often give you a clue as to where the food was coming from, and I often say, if you don't have anything better to do in your life, it's quite fun to dig out a map of, some random pre-industrial city and start analysing its food systems from the street names. Beats a night out at the pub any day. You can just get the drink in. Anyway, what's interesting about these markets, and I honestly could talk for a long, long time about the power of markets and how much they meant to the pre-industrial city, but I just want to plant a few thoughts in your head. The first is, as you may have already noticed, they were often the only open spaces in the city, because cities had to be dense and compact, because people had to walk around them. There was no other way of getting about. And they were the only places you could buy fresh food, so everybody had to go there. So they were messy, dirty, noisy, and full of animals, as in the case of Smithfield. So the sort of organic origins of food were very obvious to people living in the pre-industrial city. They also were very convivial spaces, because, of course, if that's the only open space and everybody goes there, hey presto, you start having parties. I'm sure you can all relate to that. You Melburnians, I know you like a good time. So anyway, this was St Bartholomew's Fair in 1808, which was held regularly in Smithfield every year for 900 years, and only closed down when, basically the livestock market was shut after industrialisation. And last but by no means least, the political implications of the food system were so blindingly obvious that every market space had some kind of regulation, and very often the city authorities would build the town hall directly on top of it, because that's what you wanted. You wanted to see what was going on, where the food was being bought and sold, make sure nobody had control of it, and basically, kind of lord it over the market holders. And here's a fantastic example, the Palazzo della Ragione in Padua, which was built literally, not even, in the marketplace, but sort of on top of it. And in fact, if you look at it in section, you can see that what they did very cleverly was put the political space at the first floor and just let the market run in those arcades directly underneath. So it's a beautiful, as it were, civic section that really expresses the power of the relationship between politics and commerce in the pre-industrial city. Now, don't think I was forgetting about where we are today or where you live. You can also tell the same story about Melbourne. In fact, I was amused to discover that because, of course, the town is named after the second Viscount of Melbourne, who came from this Melbourne in Derbyshire, that the name itself is a corruption of the Old English for mill stream, Melbourne. So, the very name of the city we're in basically is about food. It doesn't surprise me, but, when it comes to food, very little does these days. Anyway, so, of course, when the settlers first came, and, of course, they were looking for fertile land, just like the ancient Romans, they'd gone to Tasmania, they didn't like the look of that, so they came a bit further north, found this nice-looking fertile bay, set up camp. First thing they did was put up a tea and coffee shop, obviously, and another shed to get all the provisions in. So, food first, nothing changes. Geographically, of course, they chose the confluence of the Yarra and the Maribyrnong. I hope I got that right. At the top of Fort Phillip, nice protected harbour. Obviously, it's going to be fertile territory because the rivers are bringing all the fertility down with them. And the Hoddle Grid was a kind of highly conceptual piece of, European-derived planning plonked onto the landscape, effectively. And I should just say, because I've taken the slide out where I was going to go into more detail on this, but I'm sure you'd appreciate that there's too much detail going on already. Oops. That Paran in the southeast and up the Maribyrnong were the two very, very fertile areas, and therefore that's where the Paran market got established very early on as a wholesale market to gather all the territories, the market gardens there. In fact, I think Melbourne's quite often described as the garden city, isn't it, and the garden state, and bring it into the city. And if we look at a bit more detail at that, this is an 1855 map of those early settlements. You can see that effectively the city is sort of, as it were, skewered between those two productive areas. If we look at the Hoddle Grid, you can see there was a west market and an east market. There aren't that many, disappointingly, names that kind of talk about food in Melbourne, but there is, of course, still a market street where West Market used to be. And because there were two markets, the town hall gets plonked straight, slap bang between the two because it couldn't decide, obviously, where it wanted to go, but it knew it wanted to be nearby somehow. And then to the north, of course, the old, what's a cemetery on this plan has now become Queen Victoria Market, and situated again handily where the sort of streets coming in Flemington Road from those rich agricultural areas to the north, and of course, the horse, hay and corn market, again situated where all that food is coming into the city. And again, a vision of what markets were like, these very, very sociable spaces before these things came along. Now, that's kind of, as it were, the end of part one. And in a civilized, setup, we'd now break for a drink, and you'd all kind of refresh your brains, because I'm going to plough you with a huge amount more information without mercy. Essentially, this very early image of a railway tells you everything you need to know about what's going to change. It's carrying farm animals. And of course, there are three things really that I'd like to sort of, as it were, plant in your heads again about what changes when the railways come along. The first is that we've been talking about the ways that cities were constrained by geography, by the fact that they had to feed themselves and the difficulties of getting enough food in. That, of course, disappears because railways are capable of transporting food long distances and keeping it fresh. So cities are emancipated from geography. Secondly, because trains are now carrying farm animals rather than the animals walking into the city, you no longer have food sharing the same spaces as the people that are going to eat it. So we have the separation of the spaces that food and people occupy. And last but not least, city authorities who've been sort of risking having their heads chopped off, like Louis XVI did, for not getting it right on the food supply side, wipe a collective brow of relief and say, thank goodness for that, we can leave it up to the food production guys and take their eye off the ball, basically. So food production goes from being something that civic authorities basically have control of to being something that's controlled by the industries, with, of course, huge implications for where we are today. First image showing you this emancipation from geography. London on the left in 1840, barely grown in the 200 years since the map I showed you a little while ago, from 1676. But then all of a sudden, when the trains come, metropolitan splurgification commences. Second, over the other side of the pond, as it were, Porkopolis now goes Porkopolis Extra, because Cincinnati, which was on a river, which is why it was the first meatpacking centre in America, now gets superseded by Chicago, that just ranks it all up to about 10 times the scale, because it has access to the railways, and what the railways give it access to, these are all sort of animals in really the origins of what we now call concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. Of course, the animals were not grazing on what Adam Smith calls unimproved pasture, i.e. grass, but on grain. And of course, what the railways did is open up the American Midwest to grain production, monocultural production. The natural grasslands, which had been stable, in a fragile landscape, became unstable. The soil was no longer able to retain as much moisture. And then when there was a series of disastrous droughts in the 1920s, basically the soil got blown away in a series of disastrous dust storms. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Dust Bowl. So the writing was already on the wall that maybe this wasn't a great paradigm, but I don't think the word sustainability was around in the 1920s. But nevertheless, this did actually mark the beginning of the Soil Association in the UK, and also in the US, actually, people starting to look for a plan B, even then. But of course, Plan A is what we carried on mainly doing, and of course the railways were superseded by cars, which just made the whole problem far worse again. These kinds of landscapes that nobody in their right minds would possibly think of walking in. In fact, I've quite often been stopped by policemen in America for walking. It's seen as a subversive thing to do in these kinds of places. So of course what you do is you drive. You drive to a large box on the outside of the city, and you come back with food in boxes, because of course, the industrialized food system means that food was no longer, squidgy, squashy stuff that could go off, but it was actually processed, stuck in tins, stuck in boxes, and stuck on a shelf. And you basically come home with this kind of pile of stuff, wonder what it was you bought, stick it in your white box at the corner of the kitchen and wait for it to go off, which is basically the relationship we've got with food today. So we have people in boxes as well, because supermarkets were in fact invented by these processors of food as ways of taking the human out of the food system, because the human bit is the bit that's expensive. So what you really want is customers to come, of their own volition to the supermarket, do all the work for you, take the food off the shelf, the food speaks to you because it's got a label on it, you pay for it and you wander off again. And in fact, when you think about what's happened in the last century or so, it's a bizarre reversal of the entire relationship between food and cities. So instead of food being at the centre of the city, visible, sociable, political, let's all have a good time, etc., it's all the opposite things. Food moves out of the centre of the city, the human is excluded, the social is excluded, and it's not even in control of the civic authorities. And in fact, as this diagram shows, this is a map recently produced by New York City Council showing food deserts, which are defined as areas in the city where you're more than 500 metres away from a fresh source of food. And if you look at the red areas, that's where the poor people are. It also happens to be where the food deserts are, so go figure. In fact, there was a very controversial map produced a few years ago in the UK called the Fat Map of Britain. Britain is now officially an obesogenic society, which means just living there makes you fat. It's quite a useful excuse at times, but anyway. But it also tells you that where you live in the UK is a very strong predicator of how fat you're likely to be, and that's all to do with people's readily available income and, of course, the likelihood of living in a food desert. So it's an equitable system apart from anything else. In fact, it's a rotten system on pretty much any level you want to look at it. Here's a few scary stats for you. This is kind of like the sort of bottomless pit part of the lecture, where you all get terribly depressed, and as I say, probably break for our second restorative drink of the day in a more civilized, life. But anyway, there you go. If you look at the set of stats here, just the amount of millions of hectares of rainforests we're losing every year to the kinds of productive landscapes I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, the amount of existing arable land degraded, roughly 24%, the fact that we're using up the world's freshwater resources, we're about to heat, you've heard of peak oil, I'm sure, but peak water is around the corner as well. We're using so much oil to produce food, it takes about 10 calories of energy to produce every calorie of food that we're producing in the industrialized model, which makes clearly no sense whatsoever. And because we've externalized the true costs of industrial food, we don't value food, we think of it as cheap. Cheap food doesn't exist, but nevertheless we've invented this fantasy of cheap food, and therefore we don't value it and therefore we waste it. And finally, as I was saying, it's an extremely inequitable system. So we have 1 billion people worldwide overweight and a third of those obese, largely from eating these kinds of highly processed foods, and on the other hand we have 1 billion hungry because they're being excluded from the food system altogether. In fact, there was a study done recently by the Centre for Science and Environment in India that reckoned if you internalise the true costs of a hamburger made from meat reared on land that had been recently cleared of rainforest, and just put figures on things like climate change and resource depletion and all the rest of it, that a hamburger should cost $200 and not $2. That's American dollars, but I think it's roughly equivalent to Australian ones. And if we look at what we're facing in terms of the scale of the problem, it's enormous. Professor Tim Lang in the UK, who invented the term food miles, talks now about the new food fundamentals and the fact that, I've spoken about most of these things, but we're running out of land, we're degrading it. Food and farming are sort of together responsible for a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, so it's an enormous issue in climate change. We're running out of water, the population's about to double, or the urban population is. We're eating far more meat. The UN FAO talks about this kind of diet transition to do with urbanisation and meat consumption. Of course, as I should have mentioned, but you've probably put it together yourselves anyway, we're still eating grain, us city dwellers. We're just eating it through a cow. And it takes about 10 times as much grain to feed a human if it's passed through an animal first. And of course, the vast majority of the meat that we now eat is fed on grain and not grass. So that makes no sense either. Running out of energy, and we're running out of skills and labour because actually all the rural workers are moving to cities. So this is my sort of doom and gloom slide. It gets better after this, by the way, just in case you're getting really depressed and want to leave. Yeah, I mean, the world is turning into a hamburger, and I mean, there's lots of reasons for this. It is the corporate control of the food. It's the fact that all the profits in food are in processed food. They're not in sort of a nice, fresh, friendly lettuce that's had nothing done to it, as it were. And there's a fascinating book I always end up mentioning. I should just flash it up and have done with it, called Paradox of Plenty. I like books that have the word paradox in the title, by Harvey Levenstein, where he analyses the way the American sort of food culture that this represents evolved. And it's basically to do with European settlers arriving in America and finding each other's cuisines disgusting. So the Italian garlic and, Hungarian paprika and so on upset the other neighbours who were from different countries. So in order to get on with each other, they took all the interesting bits out of their cuisine, and what they were left with was salt, sugar and fat, which are the only three flavour enhancers nobody seemed to object to. So to make up for the lack of flavour, they just quadrupled the sizes and put lots more meat in, which is the one thing that they had in America they didn't have in Europe. Hey presto. It's a great book. Harvey Levenstein, Paradox of Plenty. Anyway, so now on to the better news. What are we going to do about it? It's not a new question. That's the first positive thing to say. In fact, for pretty much as long as people have been building cities, they've been wondering how to keep them going. Plato worried about the ideal size that the city should grow to. He worried about the degradation of the Attic hills around Athens that he saw in his own lifetime. So this issue of the urban paradox is not new. And in fact, there's a whole tradition of utopian thought about how we should live that I would say is largely grappling with precisely this problem. How do you reconcile our dual needs for sociability and sustenance that appear to be so conflicting as soon as we sort of scale the problem up? Thomas More's Utopia was a critique of London of his time. He imagined a sort of state that a Portuguese mariner accidentally stumbled upon, which is essentially a land full of largely self-sufficient trading city-states arranged in a network about a day's walk from one another. And what I find fascinating about this is that farming in Utopia was the only activity that every single citizen, men, women and children included, had to spend 2 years of their lives doing. But actually, apparently they all loved it so much that most of them chose to just carry on farming anyway. So it's a sort of garden and farming-tastic vision of an ideal world. And interestingly, it's extremely similar to another utopian vision of how we should live that you may also be familiar with, those of you sort of designers in the audience and so on, which is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model of 1902, where he argues pretty much identically the same thing. He basically says, how are we going to confront, our dual needs for town and country, for sociability and for nature? And he says we need a town-country magnet, some way of maximising the benefits of urban and rural and minimising the disbenefits. And he comes up with this, well, it's Thomas More's model basically, but with railways essentially. So exactly the same idea, dense blobs of urbanity surrounded by productive landscape and joined to one another by railway, so that basically in the middle you've got enough people living within a catchment of about half an hour's journey of one another that you can have, a decent symphony orchestra on a Saturday night sort of thing, which I happen to think is a pretty good way of defining why we ought to live in cities in the first place. So that's one response, if you like, to the urban paradox. The sort of alternative and opposite one is Frank Lloyd Wright's, which basically consisted of saying we need to stop building cities altogether. Frank Lloyd Wright was a city hater. He called cities fibrous tumours on the face of the earth. He said, mankind's only chance of salvation was to rediscover our inner agrarian and go back to farming the land. And what he proposed, and he spent 27 years of his life building models like this, trying to persuade people that it was a good idea. We ought to go back to farming, essentially living in little plots, family-sized plots, obviously designed beautifully by Frank himself, basically the biggest job pitch in the universe. That, hey presto, mankind would be saved. Two utopian visions, so what actually happens? Well, on the left, you've got Letchworth Garden City. Actually, incredibly, Ebenezer Howard got to build one of these things, except he didn't really, because all the industrialists that backed him and bought the land, necessarily hired the best architects of the day, Parker and Unwin, and got to work, actually reneged on a really important bit, which was incremental land reform, which meant that, the farmland that surrounded the city would be held in trust for the city, and as land rents rose, they would be ploughed back into the city. So they scrubbed that bit and basically built suburbia. So that's what you've got on the left, which is what a lot of people imagine garden cities are when you talk to them now. And on the right, in as it were, Frank's kind of agrarian suburbia, basically, if you wanted to have any social life at all, you climbed into your private helicopter and flew off somewhere else. So it's really ultimate fantasy land. In fact, neither of them worked. Why is that? Because they're utopian. And in fact, utopia is a sort of joke word that Thomas More deliberately adopted because it's got a double derivation from the Greek. It either means a good place or no place, which means it's ideal, but you can't have it, which I think is a bit of a shame, given that it's our strongest and longest tradition of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live. Which is why I hubristically gave myself permission to invent an alternative word, which is also derived from Greek, which is sitopia, which means food place, simply, because it struck me after about 10 years looking at this, that we already live in sitopia. We live in a world shaped by food. We just don't realise it or take control of it, so Coles and Woolworths do it for us, sort of thing. But I thought, what would it be like if we actually took food and began to use it as a conceptual and practical tool to think how we should live better? And that's really what I now spend my life doing, and what I'm hoping I'm going to help you to do in my remaining, I don't like to think how many minutes, but anyway, I'll just carry on regardless. Don't flash that 10-minute thing at me, please, Kate. What it means is seeing through food. That's essentially what it means, recognising the power that food has over our lives and seeing it. Food has become invisible to us. We've peripheralised it. We've pretended it's cheap. She's done it anyway. 10 minutes left. Anyway, I'll just go even faster if that's possible. So, seeing through food, what does that mean? It means understanding that, wherever we live, we're part of an organic cycle. And I mean, particularly if we're in cities, we have to understand it as this kind of journey of food from something we might still call the countryside through some sort of, journey of transport or regional distribution centres or factories or whatever. It gets bought and sold, cooked, possibly it's already been cooked in the factory, eaten, almost certainly not at a table, given the way things are going, wasted, almost certainly very irresponsibly, and back into the landscape again. In fact, it's a sort of eternal organic cycle, but it's far, far more complicated than that, because every stage of that journey is linked to every other stage of that journey by stuff. And by stuff, I mean rituals, habits, beliefs, preferences. My mummy didn't do it that way. All this kind of stuff that we could sort of group together and call food culture. It's hugely complicated, but it's hugely defining of who we are and how we live and how we see the world. So this is really our design medium that we're working with. Now, if you see food culture in that way, it becomes interesting if you sort of look at, a typical, we all know what we're talking about. Basically, how do we eat and what does that mean? What are the implications for what we like to eat? In fact, there's a brilliant study of this done, a book called Hungry Planet, where a couple of journalists went round basically photographing families around the world with a week's supply of food and interviewing them about what that meant. So here I've just got a selection of 4 of them for you. And I think it's very interesting if you note that actually I have to say there were 2 Australian families featured, and this was the healthy-looking one, because I wanted to be polite. But I've already shown you the Vegemite, so, you can hit me afterwards. But anyway, I think America, Britain and Australia share many, many issues here. We're all basically industrialised countries with industrialised food systems. All of the things I've been talking about really relate very strongly to us. The exception in these 3 pictures is Clearly Egypt, where, this family has obviously bought food that is not highly packaged. They probably, sort of eat their 5 a day without the government telling them to, and so on. So there's a huge amount that you can tell from just these pictures, even though I know they're not sort of scientific or anything, but I mean, just they represent so much. From a food culture, you can tell what kind of landscapes you're likely to be producing with your food, whether people are likely to have spoken to a human being when they bought and sold it, whether they're likely to eat regularly with their families. In the cases of Australia, Britain and the UK, that is not the case. In fact, in America, I saw recently a statistic that 19% of meals are now eaten in cars, which kind of makes you wonder where we're going with civilization in the first place. What is civilization? Discuss. And it all comes back to food values. Do we value food? Do we understand the true value of food and what it really means? Do we understand that it's the most important thing in all our lives or not? And if we don't, that's skewing our value system, so we have to get it back where it belongs in order to have a vision of what kind of society we're actually trying to build. And I think this is really, really important. If we're going to think about climate change, peak oil, peak water, peak everything, we need a vision of the kind of society we're trying to build so that these things appear to us as what they really are, which is physical threats to our material existence, not threats to life itself. We have to conceive of a good life that actually takes all these things into account. Food can help us do that. It can help us through the urban paradox. It can help us to actually contemplate these different visions. Do we all live, in tiny little communities growing our own food, or do we all move into vast pullulating metropolises and expect the food to come from some unseen monocultural agricultural production, call it Brazil, like magic without having to think about it. We do face real dilemmas, and in fact, I spend quite a lot of my time now sitting in conferences where people argue endlessly about how we're going to feed the world. Are we going to feed the world with industrial systems, or are we going to feed it with organic systems? They've both got unbelievable stats to back up their arguments. And I sit in the middle going, oh, guys, there's middle here. Can we talk about middle? Nobody ever talks about middle. In order to help you talk about middle, if you see through food, if you have your pineapple-shaped glasses on, then you can say, look, you're asking the wrong question. The question is not, do we feed the world industrially or organically? The question is, which of those two paradigms is going to give me my vision of a good life? So you have to have the vision of the good life first, then you feed the paradigms through, and it seems, one of them's trashing the planet. Well, maybe that isn't going to be the way we're going to feed the world, and then you start having a much more interesting conversation. So with this kind of Sitopia matrix in mind, which currently looks like a sieve, but I'm sure it'll get better as the years go on, and please feel free to make your own and share it with me. You can look at propositions like vertical farms that architects are getting incredibly excited about at the moment, and I always upset rooms full of architecture students because I start talking about the realities of vertical farming, as in, for instance, if Londoners gave up eating meat, stopped wasting, and only ate 2,000 calories a day, you'd still need 1,000 of them, 30 stories high and 100 metres by 100 metres to feed London. In other words, London would disappear. Surprise, surprise, it's an urban paradox. You can't put all the food production from a city into a city because that's what we call the countryside. And you have to think about lots of other things as well. This is a layered conversation. You have to think about ownership. If you're going to talk about the regional food shed of a city, you have to work out who's going to be organising the food. When Walmart go into what they call the Heritage Agriculture Programme, start worrying, that's not regional food. That's Walmart. 358 billion net profit last year. So we're talking about food networks, and right at the beginning you might have noticed there was a weird sort of hourglass-shaped thing in my urban paradox slide. This is what it was. It was a study about food chain consolidation in Europe and the tiny number, 110 supermarket buying desks that control the relationship between 3 million food producers in 6 European countries and 300 million consumers. And it just gives you some idea of the concentrated power that food companies now have. It's not the kind of overlapping democratic systems that I believe are necessary to create a good society. And since I now also believe that the food systems, that if you talk about food, you're talking about life, so if you're talking about food systems, you're talking about social systems, we have an unfit for purpose food system at the moment. Because we have a monopolistic one, and actually we need a democratic one. We need to re-democratize food Food planning is very useful in this respect. Actually, planners 20 years ago, roughly, started to wake up to the fact that it might be a good idea to think about food, put it on the agenda. Toronto Food Policy Council is the oldest food policy council in the world. It's the only city that actually passes all of its policies through a sort of food filter first, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So we have to, Kate's fiddling with her 2-minute piece of paper. That's really worrying. Anyway, it's like a lump of lasagna. Life is like a box of chocolates. No, it's basically we need everything. We need philosophy, we need politics, we need a different economic system, we need civil society to act together to solve this problem. But food actually brings all those things together. That's what's really fantastic about food. It's a collaborative, connective tool, something we can all share, because we already do. We already shape the world through food. In my terminology, we're all already Cetopians. So you're talking about redirecting an already existing flow. For instance, take Melbourne. You know, you've got different grains here. You've got the urban, the suburban, the rural. These are just actual shots I just took off, Google Earth a couple of days ago. What can you do with them? Well, there's lots of things, but they're different things. They're all appropriate for the scale you're talking about. So, for instance, the Vinegar Factory in New York City, this fantastic restaurant that's got actually a really decent, proper greenhouse on the roof where they grow all their leafy veg and so on. And they actually bring food producers from the New York state into the restaurant to eat and have an educational program for their customers. Transition towns, I'm sure some of you have heard of, the idea of an energy descent plan by sort of bringing all the kinds of things like food production and repair of existing things locally. Here's a fantastic and inspirational project I saw at about 11 o'clock this morning in your own town. The series aquaponics prototype. I've just kind of called it that, but actually Stephen can probably tell you more about it himself if you want to get in touch with him. But basically a kind of demountable, affordable, kind of very easy to run aquaponics system that could be put up in school courtyards and stuff, and people can start to collaborate to grow their own. He reckons that this unit, which fits into a sort of small container, could feed 50 families. Finding all those open spaces that exist in suburbia and sticking food in it. Fantastic project on the right, Edible Estates, Fritz Haig. If you look at the top and the bottom of that picture, it's the before and after of what happens to a lawn when Fritz Haig gets his paws on it. And there's a lot of lawn in America, and I dare say quite a bit in Melbourne too. Post-fitting the city. The best examples of how to post-fit a city with food happen when there's a war on, unfortunately. But of course, there is a crisis of that proportion actually happening. It's just not visible yet, so that's another thing we have to deal with. And co-producing, which is Carlo Petrini's wonderful term, the founder of Slow Food, of how consumers, by informing themselves, can actually support producers and become proactive in the act of supporting alternative food systems. Again, another example from Melbourne, also to do with Ceres, the Fair Food organic box scheme that I also visited probably at about 10 past 11 this morning. So in terms of the city, I think we need to sort of go back to interrogating the landscape like the ancients did. This is the first thing. At the moment, what we've done is built cities on all the most fertile parts of the world. Patrick Geddes' Valley section was basically saying that, mankind needs to adapt and always has adapted the way he lives to the territory he finds. Closing the loop, there are incredible examples of this historically. My favourite, Paris-Jeanvilliers on the right, is basically when the sewer engineers had the idea of filtering the sewage through gravel beds and basically producing fantastic market gardens just downwind of the city that people called the Gardens of Eden and went visiting at weekends. Little did they know it was a ship farm. Of course, I know that I'm in the home of permaculture here as well, which excites me very much because I think a lot of the things I'm talking about are essentially permacultural. It's this kind of mindset. Don't be fooled by utopia. This is a beautiful vision of an eco-city designed by Arab Associates. Everyone got very excited about it. 80,000 people, half the urban footprint of a traditional city, etc., except it's sitting in a drawer in the Shanghai Development Corporation's bank, because what they really want to build is a 27-kilometre squared intensive high-story food production unit, i.e., industrial farm. The point is all of these things are only ideas. There's some other ideas here. I mean, plant micro-logistics is basically growing plants under disco lights, which apparently they love and makes them grow 3 times as fast. On the top left is Pig City, MVRDV's, the Dutch firm's project for basically sticking pigs in luxury tower apartments until their fatal final end. And so on the seawater greenhouse, which uses concentrated solar power to create fresh water out of seawater and grow lots of lettuces in the middle of the desert, millions of miles from where anybody actually wants them, and this is the problem. All of these ideas are just ideas. The point is, how are they going to be implemented, and how do they get implemented, and what are the implications of their implementation? That's quite hard to say. Didn't know I was going to try to say it until then. They need vision. They need overall vision is the point. Through food, though, you can get that vision, because food sort of brings you back to the basics, really. It brings you back to sort of what's ethical, what's right, what's not right, the fact that we all share food. Table manners, if you like, that evolved through history in order for people to get on with each other need to go global. That's what we're really talking about. And my final slide, you'll be pleased to hear, or Kate will, at any case, is Lorenzetti's Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, which was painted in 1338 and adorns one of the town hall walls in Siena, and is about the relationship between the cities, you can see on the left, its productive hinterland on the right. It's a beautiful, beautiful image of how all of that is really about exchange and about a sort of symbiotic, beautiful balance that, of course, is in a way utopian, but nevertheless, just because it's utopian shouldn't stop us trying to move towards it with our Sitopian tools. And I think if we do that together, use food as our shareware, if you like, we can really move towards a much better, more equitable, more sustainable future. Thank you very much indeed.